Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for Feed My Sheep. With me, I have a very special guest, my former pastor from Indiana, my good friend, Gary Yochum. Gary, thank you for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, brother. Thank you.
And Gary is serving currently as an interim church at First Baptist Church in Floyd Knobs, but he's also an elder at Oak Park Baptist Church in Indiana. Well, first of all, Gary, what is it like in Indiana right now? Everybody in New York is very New York centric. All we hear about is New York. What's going on right now with COVID down there?
It's funny because our numbers are significantly higher than Kentucky's numbers, and I'm 10 miles from Kentucky, but the numbers are very different. Indianapolis is not the hot spot New York City is, but there's a large infection ratio in Indianapolis, and we're in the same sort of stay at home, be careful with gatherings, and they're increasing securities in different ways. Debbie now goes to the grocery store and she wears gloves and a mask when she goes to the grocery store, those kinds of things. So we're doing some of the similar stuff. We're not getting, it's not as severe because our capacity, our population ratio is not the same as like where you are. People are a little more spread out, if I can say it that way.
Yeah, I grew up in a place that was a very low population density, and then I came to New York, and then when I went back and lived in Kentucky, I was blown away by how wide the aisles were in the grocery store. It's like you could drive a car down them. We have roads that are smaller than that here.
Yeah.
And it is a big difference in terms of the proximity that you're required to have with other people.
Yeah, 6 feet in New York is different than 6 feet in southern Indiana. It just is. Yeah, I get you.
Well, I want to ask you about what it's like to be an interim during this particular pandemic season, because I'm sure that comes with unique challenges. And how long have you been doing that? And what are some things that you've seen that are challenging in the midst of that?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I've been serving as an interim since the 1st of November, and there are challenges there. And of course, the blessing of it is to be able to, the relationship that I was making with most of the people was through the pulpit ministry, able to preach to them, let them get used to my personality, my style of preaching, those kinds of things. And that just gave platform for then engaging in the other relationships. And that was helpful, and people seemed to be receptive to the preaching style and those kinds of things. So I was grateful for that, and just constant exposure as an interim in that role. And then, of course, COVID comes along, and that platform goes away. Now we're doing everything by camera, and it's just not the same. And so we're doing different things. You guys are, I'm sure. Our deacons are careful to reach out to our people. And I have I've called and left messages or texted or touched everybody on the membership rolls that's active still just in the last 3 weeks, just to let them know we're still here and still doing things and encourage them. It's more challenging in that aspect, really relying on my ability to connect with them through the pulpit ministry in this shortened season. And then that's been taken away from us. So that's very challenging, still thinking through some of those things, Caleb. We do different Facebook posts during the week. At least once a week, we'll go back out to them and have a word for them. We've come up with 4 priorities for the church, which I'm sure are constant priorities wherever people are. So we're reminding them of those things and just trying to stay connected. We have some life groups, and those are, just small groups that meet off campus, and they're meeting virtually and staying in touch with each other. And so there's different ways that that's happening. Yeah.
Well, it's difficult to preach into a camera. I'm learning that. I don't like doing that. It is weird to be in an empty room and proclaiming the glories of God to people that are going to hear you, but you can't see them hearing you.
Right.
And that is a big challenge for me. I was encouraged that when this first started outbreaking in Indiana, you gave a sermon at Oak Park Baptist from Psalm chapter 16. And I want to share with our folks that are listening today about that a little bit. And in the introduction to it, you mentioned Charles Simeon, who was a pastor in the past. I honestly can admit that I don't know a whole lot about him, but you said he preached to an empty room for a long time, and but the Lord was gracious to give him a blessing in his ministry. So I just want to hear a little bit more about what that was like for him and how that gives encouragement to your soul.
Thank you. Yeah, when I stood at Oak Park that day, we weren't down to the minimal level. There were probably 30 people in the sanctuary. Mostly family members of staff and that kind of thing. They don't do that now, but they were. That was sort of the first Sunday when the limitations began to get imposed. And so I'm preaching in a sanctuary that'll hold 500, and there are 30 people in there. And right away you could tell how much preachers, I know musicians do it too, but even preachers rely on the energy of the people in the room. just the nature of them being there, and you're making eye contact with them, whether they're saying amen or not. You're still feeding on their energy, and you get a sense of whether or not they're receiving you, you know what I mean, and hearing what you have to say. And that was gone. I could tell that right away. I've gotten better at it over the last 3 or 4 weeks. But that first Sunday in particular, it was very challenging. And Simeon came to mind because I do know his story not well, but I've read his biographies, the biographies about him. And when he first went to his pastorate, they did not want him to be there. They didn't want him there. And back in those days, people paid for the pews. They either bought them or they rented them. And the people that did not want them there locked their pews. And so people could not go in there. Now, he did have some people standing in the aisles, but for 12 years, there was nobody sitting in the pews. And Simeon endured through that period of time and was at that ministry for 54 years. And so that just came to mind when I looked out there, very different circumstances, but still, Gary, you don't have it so bad. This poor guy, they didn't even want him there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The church at Oak Park was empty because it was supposed to be. And the church that Simeon preached at was empty because people were just being rebellious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm encouraged that the people who are in our church are still connecting to the teaching, but I long for the day when we can be filling the churches again.
Amen.
I want to ask a little bit about Psalm 16 before we dive into the text of it, which I have here in front of me. It says that it's a miktam of David. And so we know that David wrote it, but it seems like we don't really know the exact circumstances that were surrounding the writing of this psalm. But what are some possible causes that would have led him to cry out in this way?
Yeah, I think in my study of it, Caleb, and it wasn't deep but I just wanted enough for context. But in my study of it, it could have been when his throne was being threatened by his own family. It could have been during that period of time. It could have been when Saul, early on, when Saul was after him and his life was in jeopardy, any of those sorts of situations. And if we look at it deeply enough, especially when you get into the middle of the text, it could have been at a time when things were going pretty well. And he was just sort of remembering where his blessings were coming from and who it was that had preserved him through those times. So it could have been reflective in that sense, because I think there's a piece of that, those different threats, and then the high water mark in verse 5 and 6 in particular, where he is just expressing great blessing. And I would find it difficult for myself to bless the Lord the way that David does in verse 7, 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 if I was under great duress. You know what I mean? But of course, we're not David, and we didn't have those sorts of emotional scenarios. But so I'm not sure. Most of the scholars that I looked at tend to think there was some area of difficulty that was taking place in his life.
And he certainly had a lot of those. So we could put it into any one of them. You break this sermon up into 3 main themes here: God's goodness in protection, his goodness in provision, and his goodness in his presence in our lives and deaths. And I'd like to take some time to drill down on each one of those points. So let's begin by really examining the goodness of God in protection. And I want to just read there verses 1 through 4, and then we'll consider that closely. Okay. It says, "Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offering of blood I will not pour out, or take their names on my lips." So how do we see the goodness of God in protection there in those first 4 verses?
It struck me. I was actually at Floyd's Knobs in my first series there as an interim. I spent 8 weeks preaching through Psalms. There'd been, and I don't mean this to be critical at all, but there'd been a lot of thematic preaching that was textual, but it was thematic preaching for the sake of growing the church, casting vision and doing those kinds of things. And so I thought it would be helpful, not to be critical, but I thought it would be helpful for us to just turn our minds Godward. And the best way that I could see that happening was through Psalms. And so I preached a series through the Psalms, just select favorites of mine. And in that time, it struck me over and over again, especially with David, how he started off identifying his relationship with God. He started where we should all start. "Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge." Verse 2, "I say to the Lord, you are my Lord." So he's making the personal connection that all of us should make in our relationship as we go before the Lord. So, and that sense of relationship inherently for us, if we think about it correctly, is a sense of protection. God is not going to turn loose those who are his. He honors those who are his. Doesn't mean we don't face difficulties, but God is watching over us. And then so I thought about that. Preserve me as language of protection. And so that sort of moved me in that direction too. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. And then moved into the second part where I used the term satisfied. In this protection, 2 points I made. It offers a sense of security. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. And then the second thought under that first point was it helps us be fully satisfied with God. Now, in satisfied there, we can use that in a context of, okay, that wasn't the best meal, but I'm satisfied. And that's not what I'm having reference to here.
Yeah.
The reference to is more in the Piper-esque kind of language. God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. We are fully content, fully trusting, fully rejoicing over God's goodness to us and his protection in our lives. So those things stirred in my thoughts, brothers. I went through those verses and I laid out some layers. I don't know how deep you want me to get into this, but I laid out some layers of satisfaction that stuck out to me from the passage. I don't know if you want me to address those.
I'd love to, yeah. You mentioned several layers of different forms of God's protection. I'd love to hear what those are, yeah.
Yeah, okay. The first one is of course God himself. You are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. So the bedrock layer is God himself. He is our protection because he is God and he is all keeping in that sense. And the second one, I use verse 3 and to think about the second layer, which is the people of God. The people of God is a layer of protection for us, given to us by God as part of his family. And I made some application there with respect to the church, that the church is God's gift to us. And in our hard times, the church serves as a form of protection for us in that sense. And then the third layer, I looked at verse 4 and I just saw what he's trying to avoid. And I use that as a layer of God's boundaries. His third layer is, and this sort of just moved up. The foundation is God. The people of God are another layer for us. And then that sort of overarching protection, if you will, is his boundaries, his goodness to us. Not take the name of other gods. Basically, I exhorted the church, surround yourselves with godly people and godly things. That's sort of the way that I captured that there, Caleb.
I think the single line of your sermon that stood out to me the most is when you said David's provision is enough because God is enough. And here we're moving into the portion where you talk about the goodness of God and his provision.
Right.
Let me read to the folks listening verses 5 and 6, and let's consider the provision of God here. He says, "The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance." So here, how do we see the provision of God present in these verses?
Well, again, we see how personal it is to David in verse 5.
Mm-hmm.
He's not saying that what God gave him is enough. He's saying that God is enough. You are my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. You, God. And I think David is just reminding us it's not the giver. I mean, it's not the gift that we get from God. It is the giver. And I used my tie pin. I was wearing a tie pin that day. I think I may be one of the last 10 guys in America that wears a tie pin when he wears a tie, but I don't like it flopping around. Anyway, I wear my tie pins partly because, and almost all of them are from my dad. And so when I put on that tie pin on my tie, I'm reminded of my dad. And I'm savoring his love for me. I'm remembering his love for me. And it's not the tie pin that matters. It's the one that gave it to me that matters. Right? And so I just use that illustratively. It's the same thing with God. Some of his gifts to us are priceless, most particularly in Christ. But a lot of the good things that we have around us, we would not place any sort of large value on them, but they are good because God is good. And because they come from him, we should be grateful and see that he's enough.
One of the things that he mentions here in this, he says that the Lord is my portion and my cup. And I love those terms. And, portion, we obviously think of, usually I think food when I think of the word portion. But generally speaking, what would the Israelites have been thinking about when they hear the word portion?
Well, I think it's Old Testament language. I think it has to do with, pardon that obvious statement there, we're in the Old Testament. I think it has to do with them coming into the promised land. I think it has to do with the allotment to the tribes. And I think it has to do with each tribe got the amount that that tribe needed under God's provident wisdom in that. So I think he's saying that Judah is sufficient portion. God, you are my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. Lot is again the allocation, I think, or the allotment of the particular tribes. I did note a dual meaning for the word cup. We can talk about that.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Brother.
Yeah. So
Okay.
when the word cup, obviously the Bible uses it in multiple ways, sometimes
Right.
positive and negative.
Right.
And can you just clarify a little bit of what's going on there in some of the poetic language of the Old Testament, and even as that's carried into the New Testament, how that points us to the gospel?
Yeah, and it did move my mind to the gospel as I thought about it. He talks about God. He said, "You are my cup." Then there's two forms that came to mind, particularly for me: the cup of God's blessing, which I think David is having reference to here most particularly, the cup of God's blessing. But then there's also the cup of God's wrath. Jeremiah talks about that. Jesus said, "Can you drink this cup that I'm drinking?" And they said, "Yes, we can." "Yes, you will drink this cup that I'm drinking." But he drank the cup of God's wrath for us so that we would not have to drink the cup of God's wrath. So that when I saw that and thought about it more deeply, that drove me to the gospel, and I tried to make a gospel impact in the sermon at that point.
Well, that's definitely one of the most beautiful elements that I had never seen here in this text, that Jesus took the cup of suffering for me and the cup of wrath from me so that he could give me the cup of blessing.
Right.
Like David is saying, look, you're my cup. And it's not just that he gave us a bunch of stuff, like you mentioned before. He gave us himself to be pleased with. And that is such a beautiful picture of the gospel. So thank you for drawing that out. Moving forward, you talked about the goodness of God in the presence of God in our lives. And David does definitely delve into that idea here. Let me read verses 7 through the end of verse 11. He says, "I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the paths of life. In your presence is the fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." So how did David find contentment here in the presence of God?
Well, I looked at it a couple of different ways, just sort of observations in verse 7 through 9. I saw influence. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. I bless the Lord who my heart instructs me. So I'm thinking influence. How do we get our influence? And I saw three different ways that influence took place in these particular verses 7 through 9. In verse 7, it's the influence of wisdom. You give me counsel. Wisdom from above is what we seek, and so we're looking for that. The counsel of the Lord comes to us in many ways. I talked about that, his word, his spirit, other believers, but it's from the Lord that we're getting this counsel, from his vessels to us. Also saw that his presence brings the influence of stability for us. Verse 8 and verse 9. I've set the Lord always before me. Because he's at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. That's stability. And Lord knows in these days, we need to be reminded of that stability. I didn't bring this sermon because of COVID-19. This was the first week where we were putting it into effect, but I'd already chosen this, but in God's providence, it laid in some helpful ways. I thank brother for that. And we have a lady that's on the mission field for us in the Middle East. And when she talks about gospel conversations, she talks to the ones she's witnessing to, and they talk back to her in words of dreams and visions and those kinds of things. That's how they often hear from the Lord, if you will. We don't think that way in Western culture, but they do. And so she exploits that and uses it in talking to them. And so when he talks about gives me counsel, in the night my heart also instructs me, I was reminded of that there's been times, brother, when we wake up, let me sleep on this. We just use that expression. Let me sleep on that a little bit and think about it. We wake up the next morning, and then there's just times where we just have a different clarity. I don't want to say too much about that, but I think that is a way that the Lord might give us counsel in the night, especially if we meditate on the law of the Lord day and night. Then we're going to do that as well. Yeah. So I think stability was the second one. Then the third one was just the influence of gladness and joy. My heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. And I shared some personal things with respect to my life, one of which you were very much a part of when you were down here, that took place to me, and why this psalm means so much to me. There's a very personal impact in this particular section of it for me.
Yeah. Well, do you want to dive into that, or would you prefer not to?
No, I can just say I think very quickly. It was while you were serving with us, brother. In fact, you remember it well. I went in on Friday for some heart work, and they were going to do a catheterization, and the blockage was too severe, and so they locked me down in the hospital. They wouldn't let me go home. It's different from this, but it was similar. They didn't let me go home, and we were supposed to. You'll remember we were supposed to do the service at the festival that weekend.
Yeah.
Remember that?
I do, yeah.
You and I had gone out there, and Aaron, we'd gone out there and looked over the place and got a sense of it. And in God's providence, you took the board and you took the chalk and you did the festival again. And I think that was just sweet. But it was personal to me in that sense, brother, that I never lost faith during that. It all happened so fast. I really wasn't fearful of it. So I knew that the Lord was going to protect me through that. And because he was at my right hand, I was not shaken in those days.
Yeah. I read something a while back about what it means to be at the right hand when it's talking about military terms. Mm-hmm. So in those days, you would hold your sword in your right hand and your shield in your left. So when you were marching, your shield covered half of your body and half of your neighbor's body.
Right.
So when he says he's at my right hand, you would hide actually behind the person who's at your right hand. You would hide behind their shield.
Right. So this hand is the position of honor, the position of strength. Yeah, you're right.
And so this is such a beautiful picture. And, I do remember that time at the festival very well, getting to share the gospel and getting to have good conversations with probably people afterwards who just wanted to talk about it. And that was the grace of the Lord that he had somebody in the backup position that could just step in. Amen. The Lord knew what he was doing in allowing an opportunity there. But, even in the midst of that, you are one of the people I know that takes care of yourself very well. You're physically very fit. You work hard at that. And so this was something that was a shock a little bit to a lot of us, and mostly probably genetic, stuff going on.
Exactly, yeah.
But the response that you had was not a surprise to me, that you really did lean into the Lord, trusted the Lord in those moments, and the conversations and prayers that we had during that time were very encouraging to me to see your faithfulness and your awareness of God's faithfulness to you. So I do see that this is not only something that is in your brain, this is something that you've lived out.
Amen.
And that's been a big encouragement to me. Here, I want to ask the question, I guess, when he says in verse 10, you will not abandon my soul to Sheol or let your Holy One see corruption. What are some ways that we as believers should see this verse and recognize this as a very gospel-centered help for us?
Of course, this verse is quoted in Acts a couple of different times with respect to giving assurance or proof of the resurrection, and so that we look back to that to see that when we're reading this passage, that should be mindful. We should be mindful of that. Sheol is the Old Testament word for the place of death. You know that, Caleb, and so. He's not gonna leave us dead. I saw that very much again with a gospel influence, because the Lord is going to protect his children, and death is not going to be the end of the story for us. Resurrected life is going to be the end of the story for us. So again, I tried to press in the gospel during the sermon at that point to help folks see that. Peter read about it at Pentecost, and then Paul preached it at Antioch, all again in the form of assurance. The Lord is risen. He's not going to let the soul see corruption. So that was helpful for me, and I just stressed the point there of assurance for us, no matter what's going on around us, that the Lord's going to protect here his presence. He is present with us, Caleb. You will not abandon my soul to Sheol. That's the language of presence to me. What I mean. Yeah. So I tried to stress that there for the sake of, even in our passing from death to life, or from death into everlasting life, there's not a second when the Lord's not with us through that.
I think maybe the most famous verse that I have landed on, and I think that most people's minds would recognize when they hear it, is that phrase, "In your presence, there's fullness of joy."
Yeah.
And what does that look like, and how do we as believers experience something like that?
In your presence, that means Christ is close to us, and we acknowledge his closeness. And your pastor just preached about this in a little different sort of way when he talked about we fulfill our ministry. Christ fulfilled his ministry so we can fulfill our ministry. And through all the storms and the battles, he is there. So no matter the storms and the battles, they don't take our joy away from us, because it's his presence that gives us joy in that sense. And so we don't have to, I think that just speaks to us. It reminds us that our joy is not contingent on the circumstances of our life, good or bad. We're gonna have a heightened sense of joy when things are good, just because our emotions are driven that way.
Right.
You know what I mean? And we're gonna have maybe a little lower sense of real joy when things are really, really hard for us. But there still should be joy there. The foundation underneath that is not shaken because of our circumstances. That's how that verse spoke to me. And I tried to take verse 11 and connect it to Christ, all three portions of that, and connect it to Christ for us.
So when you are, well, can you dig down into that a little bit to divide those? And what are the three different ones there?
Yeah, okay, I can. I used the first one, make known to me the path of life. And I said, God is present through Jesus for salvation. He makes known to us the path of life. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. The thief comes to steal and kill and destroy, the opposite of those. So in your presence, Jesus makes known to us the path of life. That's for salvation. In your presence, there is fullness of joy. That's Jesus too. In John 15:11, I've spoken these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full. Okay. Fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace. That comes through Christ into us. So I see that connecting. I'm trying to make this Old Testament move into the New Testament gospel, brother, with this verse. That's what I'm trying to do. Showing how Jesus fulfills these things for us. And then the third one I know you know that, brother. I'm just saying that. For eternal pleasure, at your right hand, there are pleasures forevermore. That's Jesus again. In this world, we've got tribulation. COVID-19 is bringing all kinds of tribulation. Jesus he would still tell us, be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. Though this may bring your death, I will not abandon you in the midst of this. That's where our sense of pleasure is. And this pushes it into eternity. Pleasures forevermore, which I think sets our mind in the right sort of frame, if you will, brother. You know what I mean? We're thinking about the now when we know all of God's promises ultimately find their fulfillment in eternity. So we just try to help our folks remember that.
Well, right now we've been talking primarily to believers. We've been talking to those who know Christ. We've been saying, here's what the Word of God has to say about joy and about freedom to, look beyond the circumstances of life and still find pleasure in what God has given to us and the promises that God has given to us, protect us. But when he speaks about the lines have fallen for me in pleasant places and having a beautiful inheritance, and when he speaks about having joy forevermore, these are promises for a particular kind of person, those who have trusted in the Lord.
That's right.
And so what would you say to somebody who is not a believer in Jesus Christ, somebody who maybe has stumbled across this video and they don't even know what it is, and they're just saying to themselves, I don't have this joy. I don't have this peace. I don't feel as though the lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. What would you say to somebody who doesn't know Jesus that they need to know?
Yeah, thank you. I think even for us as believers, we recognize seasons when we are not experiencing the joy of the Lord, not because of him, but just because of us, because of our sin oftentimes, or we let our circumstances overwhelm us in that sense. I think we also think about, I think we tend to think about this life, this now, this right now. And for unbelievers, for those who are not followers of Christ, I would urge you to think about the reality of your mortality. We are not going to live forever. I sort of side with Piper. He's banging the drum pretty good in the Luke 13 text with respect to this COVID. Why is this happening? We can't answer that. We don't know the mind of God in this. What we do know is it's a warning that you're going to die. At some point, you're going to die. And unless you repent, you will perish. That is, be separated from God forevermore. So I don't want to preach a gospel of fear, but I want to preach a gospel of truth that is reality. And this psalm, coming to Christ, then we know that we're not going to be abandoned. The only way that you can know that is to come to Christ. The only way that you can see my lines, I've got dots on my graph that weren't pleasant, but my lines have fallen in pleasant places as he's charted out my graph. The Lord loves those whom he calls to salvation, and he will keep those whom he calls to salvation. And he does make known to us the path of life through Christ, everlasting life. There is joy, the fullness of joy in his presence, regardless of the circumstances that we are going through. Not because of the circumstance, but because he is walking us through the dark valleys and the shadows, getting us to the other end of that. And at his right hand, there are pleasures forevermore. I'm just through preaching a couple of sermons in Romans 8 to help our folks be encouraged. And Paul talks about in the middle of that chapter, he says, the sufferings that we are enduring at this moment have no comparison to the future glory that is to come. And so I just would appeal to those who are not followers of Christ to consider the nature of their eternal soul and to recognize that Christ died for their sins so that they can have everlasting life in the presence of God. And that is the only way. And I go back to verse 1. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. David meant nothing in this world that is good apart from a relationship with God. So I would invite them to come to Christ, Caleb, or to reach out to you, or to reach out to me, and let's talk some more about those sweet truths